Have you ever walked into a place you've lived for years and still felt like a guest? Maybe you grew up moving between cities, or maybe you stayed in the same house your whole childhood, and somehow neither version made you feel rooted. You look around at people who seem genuinely at ease where they are, comfortable in their own neighborhoods, their own social circles, their own skin, and you wonder what they have that you don't. This isn't about being unhappy or ungrateful. Some people carry a specific, quiet kind of displacement that follows them regardless of where they go or who they're with. Psychology has a lot to say about why that happens, and more importantly, what it actually means. Number 1, the feeling that location won't fix it. Have you ever moved somewhere new, genuinely believing this time would be different, only to find that the same hollow feeling followed you there? This is one of the clearest signs that what's happening isn't geographic. Psychologists who study belonging describe it as a failure of place attachment, which is the emotional bond people form with their physical environments over time. Most people develop this naturally, almost unconsciously. A neighborhood becomes familiar. A home accumulates meaning, and eventually a location starts to feel like an extension of the self. For people who never feel at home, this process stalls. The apartment stays an apartment, the town stays a backdrop. And because the problem travels with them, many spend years chasing the right city, the right country, the right setting, without realizing the displacement lives inside them rather than in any address. Moving can be growth, but when it's driven purely by that hollow feeling, it tends to replicate rather than resolve it. Number 2, chronic observation instead of participation. Do you find yourself watching social situations from a slight internal distance, even when you're physically present and even saying the right things? People who never feel at home often develop a particular way of being in rooms. They observe. They read the dynamics carefully. They know how to fit in well enough that others might never notice anything is off. But internally, they feel like someone studying a culture they haven't quite joined. This pattern often starts early. Children who grew up in environments where they had to stay alert, whether due to family instability, frequent moves, or feeling genuinely different from those around them, learn to monitor rather than merge. Psychologists sometimes call this hypervigilance, a state of heightened environmental awareness that was once protective and becomes habitual. In adulthood, it shows up as that strange sensation of being at your own birthday party and feeling faintly like an anthropologist taking notes. Number 3, relationships feel close, but never quite landing. Are you someone who has meaningful friendships? Real ones? People who care about you and whom you care about, yet still feels a faint separation that you can't fully explain or close? This isn't about the quality of the relationships or any failure on either side. Some people experience what researchers describe as insecure attachment, a relational pattern formed in early life where closeness never felt quite safe or stable enough to fully settle into. The result isn't an inability to connect. It's a persistent feeling that connection is somehow provisional, like you're one misunderstanding or one move away from losing it. You might find yourself waiting for people to leave, or keeping one part of yourself just slightly out of reach. Not out of coldness, but out of a deep, old caution. Home, in the psychological sense, is often less about place and more about people who feel permanent. When permanence never felt reliable, belonging with others can feel just as slippery as belonging to a place. Number 4, a complicated relationship with the past. Does it seem like your memories of childhood or early life don't quite form into a coherent story the way other people seem to? Many people who never feel at home also struggle to feel rooted in their own history. Memory isn't just a recording of events. It's part of how we construct a stable sense of self, a continuous thread that connects who we were to who we are now. When early environments were chaotic, emotionally confusing, or involved significant loss or displacement, that thread can feel knotted or broken. Some people remember their childhoods as a series of disconnected episodes rather than a narrative. Others feel strangely detached when they revisit old places, as if they're visiting a stranger's history. Psychologists studying narrative identity, the internal story we tell about our own lives, have found that a fragmented or ambivalent personal history correlates strongly with a weaker sense of belonging in the present. You can't feel at home in your life if your relationship with where you came from feels unresolved. Number 5. The identity that shifts depending on the room. Have you ever noticed that you present differently depending on who you're with? Not just in the normal way everyone adjusts their tone, but in a way that leaves you uncertain about which version is actually you. This kind of identity fluidity is common among people who grew up needing to adapt quickly, whether to changing environments, to unpredictable caregivers, or to social contexts where being yourself felt risky. On the surface, it can look like social skill, and in some ways it is, but underneath, it often generates a private exhaustion and a creeping question. If I'm always adjusting, where is the self that stays constant? Psychologists refer to this as a fragmented self-concept, and it's directly tied to the experience of not feeling at home. Because home, at its most essential, is the place where you don't have to perform. When you've spent years adapting to feel safe or accepted, stillness can feel more threatening than any external instability. Number 6. Longing without a clear object. Do you ever feel a specific kind of sadness that isn't attached to anything you can name? A yearning that surfaces sometimes in quiet moments, or when you hear certain music, or travel somewhere beautiful and feel moved, but also somehow further from yourself? There's a concept in psychology adjacent to what the Portuguese call saudade, a melancholic longing for something you can't quite identify or return to. For people who never feel at home, this feeling is frequent and disorienting because it doesn't have a clear solution. You can't go back to a place you never fully inhabited. You can't return to a version of childhood that gave you what you needed if it didn't. What this longing often represents, beneath the surface, is a grief for belonging itself, a mourning for something that was either lost early or never fully established. Recognizing it as grief rather than just vague sadness is important because grief is something you can work with rather than something you simply endure. Number 7. What it takes to build a sense of home. The research on belonging and rootedness points towards something that takes most people who've never felt at home by surprise. Home is constructed more than it's found. It doesn't arrive when you discover the perfect city or finally meet enough people who understand you. Though those things help, it tends to develop through accumulation of smaller things, consistent rituals, spaces that hold personal meaning, relationships where you've been known over time, and most critically, a settled enough relationship with yourself that your internal environment stops feeling like unfamiliar territory. Therapy, particularly approaches that work with attachment and early relational patterns, can help untangle the original reasons the sense of home never took hold. But even outside formal support, the act of slowing down long enough to ask what rootedness would actually feel like for you, not what it looks like for others, is a meaningful start. You don't need to belong everywhere. Most people who feel genuinely at home have learned to belong somewhere small and specific, and let that be enough. If any of this resonated, it might be worth sitting with the fact that what you've been experiencing has structure and causes. It isn't a personality flaw or evidence that you're somehow constitutionally unable to belong. The people who move through life never quite feeling at home are often people who learned early that the ground could shift, that safety was conditional, that it was wiser to stay slightly unattached than to root fully and risk the loss of it. That was a reasonable adaptation. It likely protected you in ways you might not fully see. The work now, if you want it, is learning that the conditions that made unattachment necessary have likely changed, even if the habit of it hasn't caught up yet. What would you add to this? If you felt this way, what's helped you feel more grounded, even temporarily? Leave it in the comments because it genuinely helps other people in this community more than you might expect.